All right, so this is Todd Atkins, and I'm back with Miguel Iterati for another episode of the MMA Conspiracy Hour. And before we start, I want to mention our sponsor, Live to Fight Banners, who make fight banners and gym banners. Check them out on Instagram at Live to Fight Design. Use our promo code Todd Atkins for 20% off your order. Now, today we're going to discuss the announcement that just got dropped on us right before we came on, which is Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz announced for Dallas in June. And Miguel, the first thing I want to ask you is if Francis Ngannou gets an offer like within the next few weeks or a month before this fight happens, if he gets an offer, does this kind of change some of the narrative and also maybe some of the fighters that have a name in the UFC who've been out there kind of, I want to say, giving marching orders for Dana White to kind of devalue these guys and say that they were dumb to leave the UFC? Does this kind of change the narrative and maybe even change some of their minds to some degree?
I think it's an interesting announcement. I think if Ngannou were to follow up with an announcement, it would be like a 1-2 punch. You know, a couple of things that the UFC was trying to prevent, or at the very least would prefer didn't happen. Uh, are going to happen. Now, you asked if that would change the minds of some of the fighters that are still in the UFC roster and have them looking. If they do that, I think it's going to be a mistake. I think, Conor McGregor could do that. If he left the UFC roster and went and did a one-off match, he'd be a draw and a big, somebody who brings something to the table, and immediately there's news. John Jones has some of that. Like, Jones were to break up with the UFC and somebody were to pay a fortune to do Jones and Ngannou, off to the side, but it has to do with opponents. It has to do with, you can't just leave and be like, yeah, I'm going to fight Jake Paul. Yeah, get in line. Nate has been trying to make this happen for a long time, and I think Nate, one of the things I give the Diaz brothers credit for is, they're street guys and they've always sort of like not trusted the man kind of thing. But they've made that work for them because a lot of people who take that mentality, sit home and don't get the work. You do have to deal with the man at some point, and I think the Diaz brothers have a team behind them now. You get the inkling there. They think it's a co-promotion, the Jake Paul thing, with Real Fight Inc. being Nate's company. They've got guys that are backing them and helping them out to make this happen. And not everybody's ready with all that stuff. You can't just walk out of the UFC. And that's where the UFC sits comfortable. It's like you don't just walk out of there. So we've named two guys on the roster. Who else has that? Some of the lighter weight guys could maybe make some, I mean, if Sean O'Malley were to social media his way into a feud with, some rapper and they wanted to do a fight, you know what I mean? I don't know how all that stuff works, but there are a handful of UFC guys that move the needle that way but you have to have an opponent. You don't just walk out and be like, all right, I'm ready here, let's go. You have to have an opponent. And that's the one where Dana's got so many fighters on lock that, yeah, it's hard, and Ngannou doesn't have, in the prime of his career, beyond the boxing, the next logical opponent, and we've repeated this on multiple podcasts, Todd, is John Jones. Nate's in a different boat in that Nate cashes in on the Jake Paul fight, and he deserves that. He never has to fight again. What would make him come back? Maybe, by 2025, if Conor is off the roster, they can do their third fight as a one-off. And that would be big and the kind of thing that moves it. Nate's not coming back to bring up the next generation or to hand the torch off. Nate's going to cash in. So this fight isn't. He's been working on it. It happens, but very few people in the UFC roster fit the bill that way.
Right, but maybe, fighters think, okay, I can get one fight and not have to fight again. You know what I mean? And McGregor only has 2 fights left on his contract.
I used to work for Bodog, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of Calvin Ayre lore. I don't know if this is true or not, right? But the guy at some point is one of the people that wrote code that started the online casino and online poker businesses. So there are different versions of this code, but his is one of the early ones. And he made his money off of that. And when he launched it, he said, I'm going to make $10 million and I'm retiring. I'm going to go to an island and I'm done. And he made $10 million in a week. So, what are you going to do the rest of your life? He expected to have some work to do that. So again, if the bug is still there, there are fighters here that are planning, I got 3 to 5 years left, things like that. There are a few people that are on there thinking, I got one fight left in me. I got to cash in. That's not the way the careers stretch out over time. And if it is, and they get that payday, if they weren't ready to retire in other ways, psychologically, ego wise, even physically, it's like, I still feel great. They're gonna want to do it again, and then they're gonna be off of the UFC roster with no plan. Maybe they go to PFL and win $1 million there. But $1 million isn't what Nate Diaz and Jake Paul are talking about.
Right. But what I mean is you're familiar fighters. Obviously, you're in Bodog. You've match made a bazillion shows. You know how fighters think. They think their value is more than what it is, no matter where they're at
I
on the
agree with
card.
Dana.
So
Dana has softened up a little bit over time, and I agree more with you got to let them do it. If they want to do it, like I would release people from their contracts and let them go
yeah.
do it with my blessing, and I wouldn't actively work against them in any way, shape, or form. You got to let it happen if it's going to happen. But if you're confident that it'll fail, like Dana's pretty confident, it has no legs. That's the problem. Is it comes down to, again, Ngannou wanted to cash in for the biggest fight, so Tyson Fury's there. That was it. If they could do that boxing match in one of the stadiums in London, that's a fight that gives him generational money. 15, 20, $30 million, something in that neighborhood and Fury would take home more than that. If it blew up on social media and they got to like the Mayweather kind of money, that's not out of the question.
How much will Wilder give him, you think?
Wilder's not Fury.
But
Wilder's
just
never
how
been
much roughly do you think?
It's impossible for me to estimate because especially, to me, Wilder's always been a guy from Alabama that is, when you put him on Broadway, he hasn't captured America's imagination the way Muhammad Ali did. He's still a little bit of a regional guy. Like he's got his core audience, but he's not a crossover, walk down any street in America and be recognized kind of guy. Although obviously he's, people, that's an athlete. He's big and everything, but I don't get that feeling from Wilder as being that type of box office draw.
But do you think it would be half? Do you think it would be not even
Yeah,
a million? They definitely get a couple million, right?
I would almost I don't know the details of these contracts and the breakup of it, but I would venture to say that Wilder and Ngannou should have just stayed with the UFC, that the John Jones fight would produce more money than that.
Really?
But with the UFC's ability to market their fights and when they, put their machine behind it, as opposed to a one-off company built just for that doesn't have, built in, at least Jake Paul comes with 10 million fans that are going to be there, that gives him a lot of power. But Brandon Ngannou doesn't have that. So at any rate, again, I doubt that Wilder and Ngannou, it might be $30 to $50 million each, and the UFC probably generates enough money that they can pay Jones and him that. So that's what makes. I think Fury was the big fight for Ngannou there. They do it in England where that population backs a fight and a live event like that with a lot more fervor than Americans. You see when Fury fights in Vegas and stuff like that. Even go back to the days of like Ricky Hatton and things like that. There's always a bunch of toothless Brits in the audience screaming for their guys. And those guys are going to Vegas and they come to the tune of a few hundred or 1,000 for every fight. So now you do it in their backyard. You just that's the audience, you know. So I think Fury and Ngannou would have been a spectacle. I don't think Wilder and Ngannou becomes that quite that spectacle.
Let me ask you this, because I was just thinking about this now. You have quite a few big boxing matches coming up. You got Davis and Garcia, which is coming
Yeah.
up on the 15th. There's a rumor that Spence and Crawford will be announced on that night. I believe it'll
Okay.
be in June, I want to say.
Okay.
You got Haney, Lomachenko, you got Inoue and Fulton. But you can kind of throw this in there sort of as not as the level of competition as these guys, not as the level of quality, but it's another big boxing match that's going to get a lot of attention. And then if Ngannou has something, that's going to get a lot of attention, and then if Canelo and uh, guy who just beat Plant, if they fight Benavides, that's going to get a lot. So you have a bunch of big boxing matches coming up that are going to pull attention away from the UFC. What do you think about that?
At this point, you know, I don't think the UFC really worries that much about boxing and stuff. Even the big major box office fights, they just, they hit that and the boxing pay-per-views with a fight night free on the same day at the same time, and they're doing more damage to boxing than boxing could do to them. So, and I think that they are long ago done with that type of skirmishing across the sports.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't serve either of them very well, and I think that the end game could be coming here if, as we speculated, that the WWE merger comes with another announcement down the line where they purchased a few boxing people. It was interesting to see Eddie Hearn's reaction to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the idea has been planted, and that'll make them a player in all of that. Now you got a situation where you want to do one of these one-off fights, and now you've got a corporation that could say, you know what, let's see how they do against WrestleMania. And then you've hit them with something. Everybody avoids WrestleMania. Nobody else does a big pay-per-view on WrestleMania. That's the way we do things now. It's just an entity that it's like a Super Bowl type of thing, so they have to avoid it in the pay-per-view world. So what if somebody comes along and announces, Canelo versus Jake Paul or Canelo versus Nate Diaz, and they say, okay, yeah, let it run with WrestleMania then, and they keep the MMA out of it, they keep the boxing out of it. Nobody on that end loses, and they continue. They don't put a big box office draw there against another box office draw. They just smash it with something like a WrestleMania. Now this is all within the scope of something that company can do. And that's just kind of a reach, but they will control an awful lot. Like the selection of dates and things can become a problem when you're facing an entity like that. There are already in the MMA world examples from the past. I won't be able to give you the details on one of them, but you'll hear a familiar scenario. And that's that the promoters have actually had to book more than one room, book more than one building before deciding which one, in order to sort of have the UFC and and other rivals not know where they're going to run. And then they cancel the others and pick the one and make the payment, and then it's their building. But if somebody's looking to pick off and the rumor was that the UFC could go in and they would hold a bunch of buildings with the intent of running in one, but they hold 4 or 5, and now you can't even go book those buildings. Now multiply that across their capabilities with WWE and their bookings and all that, and all of a sudden, everywhere you turn to run an MMA show, you now run into that entity instead of a bunch of different people, which maybe you can work it out some way. I don't know. It seems like a big, powerful move, but I think Nate, God bless him, and it's the fruits of a long and hardworking career. I think he's gotten to the point where he's going to be more the exception to the rule than the rule. I don't think people should be looking at this and saying, "Oh, I'm next."
But over the last few years, it's kind of like boxing has kind of shot itself in the head a little bit. They didn't have a lot of matches we wanted to see. And now they're ripping off about six of them. So in a way, they're gaining a little bit of, at least among this Davis Garcia fight's going to be huge, bigger than anything UFC's put on in a while, you know. So I mean, it's kind of like they're getting some new life, but you don't think it'll matter ultimately.
No, I don't, because those things are cyclical. The UFC sometimes goes through a period where okay, you get a couple fight nights in a row where they're all from the contender series and you haven't seen them, you don't know the names and stuff. I wonder how many people follow the sport to the level where they know every single fighter on the roster and stuff. They prevent that. So, I guess in the baseball and football, people know every player on every team. There are guys like that out there. So I imagine maybe in the UFC, there are guys that know every welterweight and every, whatever out there and stuff. But that's, the type of control that they exude. So yeah, I'm not buying that this is good for anybody else, but the UFC, they'll sit and wait. And nothing will materialize for most of the guys that try it. And it'll continue the same way.
Do you think something materializes with Ngannou within the next month?
I think Ngannou is a guy that the UFC dealt with him enough. I think it seems like they had an ace up their sleeve with, or could have an ace up their sleeve, where should they wind up as buying Matchroom Boxing and some British entities of boxing, um, along with the WWE, and the totality of the deal includes that, then Ngannou was negotiating. It will be negotiating with them again to make that fight. You see, so I think, yeah, I think that overhangs everything because Ngannou could get the Fury fight's the big money fight. Fury's also been dabbling with having a fight with Usyk for the unified heavyweight belts, which is an equally big fight. The thing about Usyk is he comes from Ukraine, and as well as the media pop that may have, Ukrainians like Russians, like their cousins or whatever. Hey man, they back their guys with betting money. I.e., check the Klitschko brothers. And their dominance of boxing for a long time, and that is for one reason only, is because they had backing. They had such backing that one of them, I think, is still the mayor of Kiev, the older one.
Yeah,
Um,
Vladimir. Yeah.
so Usyk and Fury is enough to distract Fury from the Ngannou prize. I think Fury looks at Ngannou coming to box him like, that's a joke. That's a joke, especially to Fury, because Fury's become, at least for this era, very sophisticated.
Now, who do you think's going to win this fight? I was telling you offline before this Tommy Fury fight, I would have said Jake Paul for sure. I felt like he's the bigger guy. He's looked decent in the fights leading up to that Tommy Fury fight. But after the Tommy Fury fight, maybe I have some pause now. What about you?
I think you have to see the fight, because I think the problem with Tyrone Woodley, Ben, and some of those guys is that they went into it with a let's wait and see attitude. Let's see what he's got kind of thing, and they played that game and basically didn't show anything, other than I don't know, submissiveness almost. you know. So if Nate should come out, Nate should everything we know about Nate in terms of cardio and things like that. Nate is should avoid getting hit, and Fury, the Fury, Paul has shown me no real combos or anything like that. He tries to set up his one big punch. Right? So Nate avoids that, puts the pedal to the metal, and wears him out in probably 2 rounds. He shouldn't be able to keep up with Nate. Nate's got 20 years of doing this where the cardio has always been, the one thing that he's always been able to bank on. Even now, if he's going to come in to his fight, say 190, carrying extra weight and stuff, he should be able to set a pace that the other guy can't keep up with. I trust that his 20 something years in the martial arts will also put him at a more sophisticated level on every level than Jake Paul's, give him credit for a crash course the last couple of years. Crash courses don't work. A lot of this is about paying dues.
Yeah, I also think it'll be interesting, because Nate Diaz, he didn't really like to fight wrestlers. Now he doesn't even have to worry about it. He can just focus his training on boxing, his conditioning on boxing, like you mentioned, and like you said, probably even be able to put out more than he has in some of his MMA fights.
Yeah, he's 37. So, that's a good time to be retired from the UFC because the UFC is the best guys in the world and is a meat grinder. But it's by no means a guy, who's done, if so I think he can get a few big matches like this, bank in some money. And yeah, you're right. If it's not MMA and you take out all the ground training of, just getting up, we're older guys. It's like, man, sometimes just getting up. It's like how many times you have to get up when you're rolling? You know what I mean? It's like I think standing up and just hands, because it's not kicking in elbows or knees and things like that. Just hands. I think this is a walk in the park for Nate in terms of jumping the high level training right away, sticking with it. I think he's already more advanced. 10 years ago, these guys were sparring with Andre Ward. You don't know who Andre Ward is, look him up. But let's say, Floyd Mayweather is the best boxer of the last 30 years. Let's take Floyd out of the conversation. If the next name up is not Andre Ward, he's on a list of about 3 guys. And that's that. Andre Ward is a guy who hasn't lost a fight since he was 14, retired undefeated, world champion, Olympic gold medalist, the last American Olympic gold medalist in boxing. And that's who they sparred with. And I've seen Ward do interviews where he says he gets, he needs work. He gets rounds with those guys. Again, the cardio comes into play. 3 to 5 rounds, he's grateful to them for the work. Yeah, of course, he's a better boxer. That's not what it's about. But it also goes to show that back then, Jake Paul doesn't have anything like that in his background. Being hungry between UFC contracts, at war with the UFC, F you in the media kind of thing, negotiating, doing the best you can, but still looking to go to a gold medal, undefeated Olympic level boxer, world champion level boxer, just to get rounds in. No cameras around, no nothing. Jake Paul has nothing like that in his resume. At some point, things like that should show. If a fight is done 100 times at full speed, with with the intent being to kill each other, or get the other guy out of there, not survive or any of that stuff, then Nate should win 98 out of 100 times.
Now, I need to correct myself. It's actually Vitaly who's the mayor of Kiev, not Vladimir. But how crazy do you think the promotion of this Diaz Paul fight will be?
Jake Paul just is coming off a loss. So there are a lot of people that, I think are going to take everything he says with a little bit of a great, like, I wonder if he's going to be humble, or I don't know. I don't know. I've never really been that enthralled with it, but I think it's just media nonsense like that, like the moving of social medias and things that'll generate the big money for the fight. And, like I said, Big Paul has his audience there. So he's an entity. You can't not deal with it. And Nate brings, several million, what do you call the Diaz? Is it the Diaz Army that they call themselves?
Yeah,
That's one of the little
yeah.
nicknames, But that's a very real entity. You know what I mean? It's like, don't discount that, because those guys, show up in the fights and they buy beer in the audience, or, a Coke and a shirt and a hat, and they back their dudes. And, that's at the end of the day why he's in that fight, is because his audience is tested. Somebody else, even Sean O'Malley, would be running a risk. He has an audience, but it's a very canned audience for what he did. Not crossover, but the Diaz brothers crossed over 10 years ago with their, weed smoking, badass personality, whatever. And it held water. So whatever you want to do, they're in that position because of that and that work.
Now, I want to close with this. Davis Garcia, it's coming up in a week. You're kind of a boxing historian, before MMA. How big do you think this fight is?
I think you got Haney Lomachenko there, and I think you've got maybe Teofimo Lopez in there and stuff. I think you've got the makings of a tournament, and the possibility of a lot of guys getting defined there. I think
Shakur
Garcia.
Stevenson also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you've got talent in that division, and what we talked about is, yeah, after that fight, what's next? And that's, so there is some longevity there and some ability to do that. I think this fight is notable because both guys are putting their undefeated records on the line. Both guys have gotten to the point where they are there, and unlike Crawford and Spence, when you mentioned it, I said to myself, man, that's at least 3 years too late, at least.
Yeah.
And this one's not. And that's what makes it remarkable, is that these guys are both still in their prime. They've gotten to the point where they're both. Garcia is another guy that he moves the needle on social media. He's got that youthful charm where he brings an audience of people. My 12-year-old follows him. And, there are videos and stuff. And, the kid speaks Spanish. My 12-year-old's, Latino speaker. So he's a Spanish speaker. But he will hopefully get that to pay off for him in the long run, because he's paid those dues. And that's what a lot of people don't have. Garcia has that. And, on Davis's end, Davis comes from the Floyd camp. I'm pretty sure they've separated since, but with that pedigree and stuff, he sort of assumed the mantle that Mayweather had, of being like that Broner failed to get, but of just being that bad guy that doesn't care, that does things his way, kind of thing, that isn't dictated to. And I think Gervonta's got a little more street, obviously, in him than Floyd. At the end of the day, Floyd, grew up in a boxing gym and boxed his whole life. He doesn't really have a lot of street fights and stuff. He was in the Olympic path, and went to the Olympics and stuff like that. He was pretty focused on that. I think Gervonta's got a little more street cred too, and he made that work for him too with the box office stuff. I think I think it is a little bit of a powder keg, but I think people are okay to, to get that managed. He's literally kind of got that Allen Iverson appeal.
Yeah, I think he's, as a guy who he's going to show up and knock his opponent out or die trying. He might be the most exciting fighter in combat sports in that regard. Because when he fight, I don't think this fight's gonna go the distance. I
Yeah.
think
Oh well.
Davis will knock out Garcia or get knocked out by him, one or the other. He doesn't try to protect himself as much as Floyd did in the past.
Yeah, his style's a little different. I don't think nobody wants to get knocked out. Um, and I think he's grown very confident in his knockout power. But I think you like to see guys like that still grow from here to there, and that's what I think Garcia is for him. Is a guy that is going to show some growth. He's going to have to show some growth to beat Garcia. And it's interesting in styles, because Garcia's longer and taller, and he's stocky and stuff. Hey, if Garcia fights the perfect long and tall match, and with his power, tosses in some long and tall power like a Tommy Hearns type, hey, it could be trouble for Gervonta, who's gonna have to maybe work to get in. But Gervonta's gotten everybody before, so I'm dying to see it. I literally pumped for that fight, but I think what makes it more interesting is you have Lomachenko or Haney or Lopez, Shakur Stevenson also undefeated. Um, a lot of options there, right in the lightweight category without having to move, and that's boxing deserves that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time because, like I said, boxing, I think it kind of hurt themselves for a while and it kind of allowed the UFC to step on them a little bit because they weren't giving people the fights they wanted to see for quite a while. But it looks like they've started to correct some of that or maybe put more of an emphasis on it, with some of these matchups
Is the
that they're stringing
PBC the
along.
premier boxing champions alive still?
That I don't know. Actually, I think it is.
See, because that's the the albatross around boxing's neck the last 5 years was that the PBC and Al Heyman came in like a bull, and obviously, they've gone out like a lamb. But when you come in and are going to take over boxing, and they had a lot of backing, a lot of appeal, they had TV deals, they had structure, they were working on titles. But, again, it's a fickle sport, They set up matches. I think it was Bo Jack, uh, a Floyd Mayweather charge that was in a world title fight, I think, with James DeGale from England. Again, just international, good level, high level stuff. DeGale, an Olympian who I think was very underrated, until he was past his prime. But and they wind up with a draw, and then so you've got to manage a draw. When the UFC has a draw, bam, drop. Next week they got the fight. But then they're like, oh, no, we can't do this fight and then this fight. And you start thinking about it and you've got no continuity. The PBC didn't, at the end of the day, now looking back at the last 5 years, the PBC didn't deliver on their original promise, which was to take over boxing and be the big entity similar to the UFC. And that's what's hurt boxing. Now they're recovering from that. And people are starting to learn to play together again. So we'll see how it goes. But it is a good time to put together some of the fights that we've been missing for a few years.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see the fallout of this fight coming up in 2 weeks, and then Paul and Diaz, obviously. Well, Miguel, as always, I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's kind of short notice, and for everyone that enjoys the MMA Conspiracy Hour, we appreciate the support. And until next time, take care.